Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. My guest today is Professor William Wallace. Professor Wallace is the Barbara Murphy Bryant Distinguished Professor of Art History at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, of whose renowned Art History and Archaeology department he serves as chair. Professor Wallace received his PhD in Art History from Columbia University in 1983. Since then, his literary output for both lay and academic audiences has been prolific. Along with countless articles, essays, columns, and critiques, Professor Wallace has put out 3 books to which, dutifully, I'll provide links in the show notes below, as well as one magnificent lecture series through the Great Courses Company, to which I urge everyone listening to purchase himself or herself a membership, about the man around whom today's conversation will revolve. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, or as he's mononymously known, Michelangelo. Professor Wallace, it's with perfect sincerity that I thank you for joining me today.
Glad to join you, and as we talk, I will probably say Michelangelo only because we're in America, and I generally say Michelangelo when I'm in Italy and speaking Italian, and I just think it sort of sounds a little artificial in America because most people think of him as Michelangelo. If that's okay with you, we'll go forward with Michelangelo.
Perfectly suitable to me, and that's actually one point I wanted to raise, the correct pronunciation of the name. So we'll go forward with Michelangelo for today's episode. So Professor Wallace, be so kind as to acquaint us with this man, this Michelangelo fellow with whom you've grown to be so intimate over the course of the past 3 decades. Give us the basics upon which we can then build. When was he born? In what city? What country? Under what circumstances?
Well, I'll introduce him in the way that I was introduced, as the way most people, I think, are still introduced, and that is as an 18-year-old reading The Agony and the Ecstasy, which is still in print. And although published in 1952, this book has been translated into, I think, 60 different languages and is still in print. And it's a really, I think, a very good introduction to Michelangelo, even though it is a novel and therefore certain things are made up. But nonetheless, Irving Stone had done a lot of homework and he had translated Michelangelo's letters so that he had a very good insight into this man. Michelangelo was born in Florence in 1475 on March 6th. So every March 6th, one should celebrate an anniversary. He's more than 500 years old. And yet one of the remarkable things, I think, is that we still are fascinated and we can still learn from this artist. Even 500 years later, we're still talking about him.
Oh, very good. And in the words of the great aesthetic philosopher and writer Walter Pater, an Englishman, he said, individual genius works ever under conditions of time and place. So what were the times and places in which Michelangelo worked? What was it like in Italy at that time, in that century?
That's a big question, but wonderful. Michelangelo, of course, was born, well, not of course, but he was born in Florence, not exactly in Florence, but outside of Florence, some 60 miles to the east in a little town named Caprese, which now has taken the name Caprese Michelangelo as sort of the only reason for its fame. Michelangelo was born there because his father was a functionary of the government of Florence and had a 6-month appointment as a kind of local governor for this very, very tiny hamlet that Florence dominated as a political power. So nonetheless, Michelangelo felt like he was a Florentine and very soon moved back to Florence and made his home in Florence. And still true today, most Italians feel themselves to be born in the city where they're born, more importantly than the country of Italy. Since it was not a country unified until the 19th century, Italians are most loyal to their home city. And this is very true of Michelangelo. His entire life, he felt like he was a Florentine and devoted to Florence as a city. And of course, Florence at this time was in one sense, a center of the world, probably one of the richest cities in the world, largely because of banking and the wool business. The Florentines figured out how to make money, and they did it very well. They still manage to do it very well. They make a lot of money from tourism now mostly, but they still have leather production, which was also something they did in the Renaissance that is very attractive to most people who visit Florence. Italy at the time that Michelangelo was born in 1475, somewhat chaotic, although born into a moment when most of these individual city-states had come to some kind of peaceful accommodation with one another. Since about 1440 or so, they had agreed not to go to war constantly with themselves, but war was a constant threat. And in fact, Michelangelo lived through some very disruptive periods in his life, largely because he lived so long. He lived almost 89 years, which was about double what it was the average age in the Renaissance of maybe 40 or 45. And as Michelangelo would frequently say, at about age 40, he began to expect to die because all of his contemporaries were beginning to die at that age. And then he thought about dying for the next 50 years, which comes out sometimes in his letters, in his ruminations, even in his art a little bit, and certainly in his poetry. Especially as he grew older and older, he became more and more conscious of death. And I would say this is the overshadowing factor that probably affected Michelangelo for much of his life, at least half of his life. The fact that he was living so long and had, in his mind, so much to do, and yet not enough time to do it.
Do you think that imagined imminence of death focused his mind more than it otherwise would have been focused, and elevated him to even greater greatness in his art?
I think so. But this would be, I would say, the latter part of his life. Early in his life, he was like everybody else, ambitious, incredibly competitive, sure that he was going to conquer the world and create great wonders. And in fact, he did. Wonder after wonder after wonder in his early life. But it is towards the latter part of his life when he began to realize that death was imminent, and that he even thought, wasted his life on spending so much time making art. Whereas he should have been thinking about his demise and death and his afterlife. And he became closer and closer, I would say more and more religious as he became older, as he grew older. And this definitely affected the kind of art he made and the way he made art in the latter part of his life.
And yet, right up until the end of his life, if I understand his biography as laid out by great lecturers and authors like yourself, he continued to work. He never did, in modern parlance, retire from his job, which was more of a calling in his case. I find that so admirable, and I often recommend people to try to find some sort of calling that inspires them to continue working right up until the end. Maybe you can comment just briefly on that, the assiduity that he showed throughout his life. We're talking 8, almost 9 decades, removing the very earliest years of his life, even though he tells an anecdote that he was basically nursed in the quarries of Carrara. Maybe talk about the length of time to which he dedicated himself to his craft or his crafts.
No, it's a very good point. And yes, he never did retire. And I kind of like to joke to people I lecture to that if they're thinking about retiring at 70, you should take Michelangelo as a model, because at 70, he in fact finally completed the tomb of Julius II, which had been sort of an albatross around him for 40 years. And here was a moment when he triumphantly finished this gigantic project, the great tomb of Julius II, and having lived in Rome for the last 30 years, was more than ready to return to Florence, where his diminishing family, many of his members have already died. He desperately wanted to go back to Florence and die in Florence. And it's at this moment, at age 70, when the Pope comes to him, Pope Paul III, Farnese, comes to him and says, "You're not retiring, you're taking over St. Peter's," which happens to be the largest construction site in the world at the time, and had been under construction already for 40 years, but had advanced very, very little. And in fact, looked more like a Roman ruin than it did a new church. And Michelangelo, who all of his life thought of himself as a sculptor, complained to the Pope nonstop that I'm not an architect, I can't do this, I'm 70 years old, I'm not going to live long enough to see it completed, which is true. I want to go back to Florence. But the fact is, you don't say no to a Pope. And when the Pope says you're taking over St. Peter's, he takes over St. Peter's. And the last 18 years of his life were devoted to not only St. Peter's, but in Michelangelo's own words, he was devoted to God. He really profoundly believed that God had placed him here and called himself God's architect, which is the title of my last book, because Michelangelo really felt that he was placed there to do this last deed in life, to complete St. Peter's, which of course he did not complete by any means, but devoted 18 years to it. And because of the strength of his design and the brilliance of his ideas about how to build a dome, the dome that was built well after his death is really Michelangelo's. St. Peter's, completed well after his death, is nonetheless considered St. Peter's is considered Michelangelo's. I consider it Michelangelo's masterpiece, and I hope after people read my book that they will also consider that this was for him the most important project in his life, the devotion to St. Peter's and the completion of this church.
Yeah. One can't but marvel at the indefatigability with which he pursued these projects, even under some adverse circumstances, as you mentioned. His reluctance to take on a project for which he felt himself, somewhat unqualified. And we see that time and again, all right, when he was selected by Pope Julius, a more tempestuous pope, to paint the rooms in the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He much preferred to have another great artist, a contemporary by the name of Raphael, do the work, and yet he sort of begrudgingly and with great modesty took on the project. And of course, we all know how that turned out, quite magically. Now, Professor, as I reflect on history, I'm tempted to believe that there are certain ages, perhaps selected by Providence or perhaps by the uncaring hand of random chance, in which genius is concentrated. I think of the age of Pericles in Athens, the age of Augustus in Rome, and in America, the age of our founding, in which an abundance of extraordinarily talented and courageous men seemed to spring up from the barren soil of an English colonial outpost. The Renaissance was one such age into which genius, artistic genius specifically, was very densely packed. You mentioned the peace that Florence experienced at that time and its material prosperity being an epicenter of trade. But why was it so fruitful an age for the production of great, immortal art? Why did it give birth to these artists like Raphael, of whom we made mention, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci, and many others?
I can't tell you why all those people were born at the same time, but they were, and this is remarkable. And it is a nice parallel to like Periclean Athens, or maybe our founding fathers, that at certain times in the world, and I think Kenneth Clark actually pointed this out in Civilization many, many years ago when he did that really wonderful series on civilization. He said that there were just times in the world when geniuses were born together. And in the case of the Renaissance, it's more than just two. As you mentioned, it's Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo are all exact contemporaries. I mean, Leonardo's a little bit of a generation ahead of them. But nonetheless, all three of them were in Florence at the same time in 1504. And we're talking about a very small city. a city of 50,000 or so, where everybody knew everybody else, especially in the upper elite and especially among the artists. And the fact that Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo are all living in the same place, and they're all making masterpieces at the same time in 1504, and the same thing happens again in Rome in 1513, a few years later. All three of them are again in Rome, and they're making fantastic works of art. It's very clear that they all fed off of one another. There's there's certainly competition here, but as Giorgio Vasari, the writer of the lives of the artists, repeatedly says, the competition brings out the best in all artists. And that's absolutely the case in these three artists who were working together in Florence. They were feeding off of one another, inspiring each other to do even greater and grander things in the world. And one thing that they did together, I would say, is certainly elevate the status of an artist. An artist at that time was mostly a manual laborer and pretty low in the social hierarchy of things. And yet with the creation of the genius of Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo, people began to recognize that artists are really at the forefront of thinking. They're the geniuses that are leading us into the future. And so they really did more than anybody else to raise art from being a manual, something of a manual labor, to a craft of genius, and from sort of an artisan to a gentleman. They became gentleman artists, and so in that way they entered into the highest of the hierarchy, of the social hierarchy of their time.
Of course. Now, you mentioned the fierce competition that defined this age and this era. It was something of iron sharpening iron, or marble being sharpened by marble. Now, that's fascinating because we're talking about an age predating classified ads and LinkedIn pages. I'd assume that during this time, it was difficult to secure commissions, and it was on commissions that these artists predominantly lived. So tell us, how would an artist go about getting work, getting a gig in Renaissance Italy? And what about that competition? You mentioned Leonardo da Vinci. I mentioned Raphael. The latter was his elder, the former his younger by a few years. I think historically, or maybe mythologically, they were rumored to be great rivals. So what were their relationships like, these three great geniuses who were concentrated in Italy at that time? And what was it like to get commissions to create these great projects?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They were fighting tooth and nail to get commissions. Most of the commissions are coming from the church. That's the most obvious source of money at the time. And one thing that changes, I think, partly because of these artists and because of their competition, is the growth of private commissions. The desire all of a sudden not to have a chapel altarpiece or your frescoed chapel, but to have a work of Leonardo da Vinci was all of a sudden becomes desirable, or a work by Michelangelo, highly desirable and very, very difficult to obtain. A work by Raphael, a little bit easier to obtain, but nonetheless still of a very great desire. And so, yes, one thing that they accomplished, I think, together was to expand tremendously the art market. Suddenly there is an art market. It's sort of maybe the beginning of an art market in the Renaissance. So competition was fierce. And before these three came along, I would say, you didn't do it alone. You didn't go in and become an artist and do things by yourself. You always did it in collaboration with people, and they worked together in botteghe, that is workshops, oftentimes very large workshops where you had a combination of specialists, somebody who would carve wood and somebody who would paint the underpainting and somebody who would transfer the designs and somebody who would make the designs, and then the painter who would come along and finish the work. So this was an elaborate and complicated system of supporting the artist in order to create these commissions and complete these commissions. It took a large group of individuals to carry these commissions out. And I think one of the things that changes all of a sudden is that Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael are doing it themselves. I mean, Raphael runs a huge workshop, and Leonardo had plenty of followers. But basically, Michelangelo carves the David by himself. And no, he didn't paint the Sistine by himself, but he had only, a minimum amount of help, and he did everything that was most important there. And so we think of that as a Michelangelo. So I would say, they really changed the nature of making art, that suddenly you wanted not a work from the workshop of Perugino, but you wanted a work that was painted by Leonardo or carved by Michelangelo himself. And this is a new desire, and all of a sudden a new market. And it really does expand not only the possibilities of artists, but it elevates the artists themselves. They become the desired product.
I wonder if there was, in the upper segments of the hierarchy in the Catholic Church, some disquiet about this. Now, of course, the popes and the bishops, they wanted to commission these works mainly for their own personal aggrandizement. But at the same time, you have something of the glorification of the artist, as you described it, and maybe a lessened consideration of the divine, or the ideal for which this man was working. Was that ever an issue?
I don't think it. No, I think they went side by side. The glorification of the artist and the elevation of the artist, the supremacy of the artist as an individual, went along with the fact that they were deeply, deeply Christian. Maybe not Leonardo so much, but certainly Michelangelo, deeply, deeply Christian, and still constantly working for the church. I mean, you didn't pass up those opportunities, because the church still has the most money in the world, and they are the most important commissioners. So I think it was both were going on simultaneously. And think back to Michelangelo, what he thought of his greatest work was to give St. Peter's to the church, or to God. Mm-hmm. So he never gave up the desire to work for the church. And I don't think the church probably ever felt like that they were being ignored, because they were constantly being satisfied by other artists, maybe, if not by a Leonardo or a Raphael.
Right, of which there was a plethora at that time.
A plethora.
So I want to discuss, if only briefly, the unintended consequence of the beautification of Rome, of the Vatican specifically, for which Michelangelo was, perhaps more than any other man, chiefly responsible. And that is the Reformation. We're deviating a little bit away from art history to history, so indulge me. Speaking of indulging, a large portion of the indulgences sold to the laity of Europe was used to fund breathtakingly grand yet nauseatingly expensive artwork. St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, the tomb of Pope Julius, etc. So on all these great works, Michelangelo labored, for which he was magnificently well compensated. One could argue that the artwork he was commissioned to make caused, at first, the disunion in the Roman Church, and finally the irreconcilable schism that separated the Protestant North and the Catholic South. So, a bit of a naughty question. Is Michelangelo in some way culpable for the Reformation and the disunion of the Catholic Church?
I wouldn't blame it on Michelangelo, but I do maybe blame the church. The church's desires of building a new church like St. Peter's requires the sale of cardinalships and indulgences. And I think it was that kind of ill behavior or non-spiritual behavior that particularly irritated Martin Luther. But thinking about Michelangelo, I think of him, this was a horrifically difficult thing for him to live through. He lived through the Reformation. I would say Michelangelo, because he lived 89 years, basically lived through 3 eras of time. He was born into an era where there was a single unified Catholic Church. And in his mind, everybody was a Catholic, and anybody who wasn't a Catholic was a heretic. And so then all of a sudden the Reformation comes and the church splits apart. And this was, I think, devastating for Michelangelo. And yet he contributed a great work of art to each of these eras. In the first era, you can say the Sistine ceiling. In the second era, when the Reformation starts to question what the church is about and what it's doing, Michelangelo reasserts and reaffirms the importance of the church by painting something like the Last Judgment. The Last Judgment painted right during the Reformation, right in contrast to what Luther is saying, that there are no saints and we're not believing in relics. Here we have the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel telling us, no, there are saints, there are relics, and we should believe in these things, and these are the centerpiece of our religion. And then he lived long enough to actually go into the post-Reformation, or the return of the church in power, contrary to Luther. And that's where Michelangelo contributes St. Peter's as a, the church reasserting itself and its importance in the world by building the largest church in Christendom.
Yeah, the Counter-Reformation, right?
The Counter-Reformation, that's what I meant.
Yeah,
that was a misspeak.
Yeah, no, quite all right, quite all right. That's extraordinary. Yeah, to have lived through each of those dizzyingly tumultuous phases is really something to consider. I mean, nowadays we live in a quite tumultuous time, when things seem to be constantly changing, but maybe not on the same scale as the complete rupture of an institution that existed for 1,500 years. It's a shame, though, that Luther couldn't have been convinced by the sublimity and the grandeur of Michelangelo's work into keeping with the church. So one of my new favorite adjectives derived from the name of our subject is Michelangelesque. What does it mean to be Michelangelesque? What are the unique qualities of Michelangelo's craft that distinguish him from all other artists?
Yes, I would define Michelangelesque by using another word, which is Michelangeloid. Those people who are trying to do Michelangelo after Michelangelo, or even during Michelangelo's life, trying to imitate him, really couldn't do it very well. And very few examples we have of people who accomplished the Michelangelesque, that is, looking truly like a Michelangelo. Moreover, more likely they are creating something Michelangeloid, a little bit awkward, a little bit weird, a little strange, clearly inspired by Michelangelo, but incapable of accomplishing exactly what he did. So Michelangelesque is trying to do a Michelangelo, but very few people manage to ever do so. In that sense, I would say Leonardo and Raphael were much more successful. They were much more imitatable. And people were able to sort of understand how Leonardo was painting and could paint more like a Leonardo. And Raphael certainly expanded, tremendously in terms of people imitating, copying Raphael, copying his system, his works. Michelangelo was just very difficult to copy, partly maybe because how many people need a Sistine ceiling? He made unique objects, and so in making unique objects, there's no imitation allowed. How many people, how many Davids do we have in the world? We have a lot of copies of the David, but they're just copies of the David. They're not really Michelangelo's or new Michelangelo or not Michelangelesque. They're just copies. So that is, I think, one way that Michelangelo actually made a reputation. And he learned this, I think, from Leonardo, to make unique objects that were not to be imitated, that could never be done again. Leonardo's great idea was to create the greatest horse, the greatest equestrian statue in the world. And even though he didn't carry it out, the idea inspired other people to do something of the same thing. And I think the David, which comes shortly after, like Michelangelo learns about Leonardo's horse, is a kind of response to that idea, to create something so startling, so different, so unique, that people are just going to say, that is Michelangelo, and that's Michelangelesque, and anything trying to imitate it is going to be probably Michelangeloid.
Do you think that those who aspired to Michelangelesque and settled at Michelangeloid were those who produced works of mannerism, and maybe you can define mannerism and answer that question.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Mannerism, the word comes from mano in Italian, hand, or maniera, a style, the style of your hand, the style of your particular art. And so mannerism comes about because of people trying very hard to imitate Michelangelo. And I think he is largely responsible for the development of mannerism following him. These are people who are trying to sort of do Michelangelo, but trying to do it sort of their own way and individual, giving it an individual style, an individual maniera. But that individual maniera tended to be sort of imitative of Michelangelo and partly different, and therefore oftentimes very strange. And so the period that we call mannerism is certainly that era after these three great giants have produced all these fantastic works of art, and people are beginning to think, what next? How I don't want to do Raphael, I don't want to do Michelangelo, I don't want to do Leonardo. I want to do something myself and individual, but nonetheless, those people are there having provided the precedents, and I can't ignore them, and nobody else will ignore them. So I'd better do something that looks a little bit like them, but individual. And generally, that is a failed endeavor because it's not particularly unique or individual. So mannerism, I think it's a fascinating period. It's a period of real creativity and inventiveness. It just doesn't appeal to everybody because it looks so strange. So much of the art that comes out of it is a sort of like Michelangelo on steroids or Leonardo in the atmosphere. I don't know. It's people trying to make masterpieces like these previous artists, but not quite succeeding to the same level.
Yeah, it might not be steroids that they're taking, but some sort of other hallucinogenic drug. and to all the viewers or listeners taking in this conversation, you can do a quick Google search of mannerism, and you'll see these kind of sinuous, elongated necks and limbs, and things just look a little surreal. It looks a little off. It's certainly not consistent with the classical form of which Michelangelo and his contemporaries were.
Yeah, I add something to what your good comment was. You're exactly. If you look at Michelangelo's figures, they are equally, oftentimes, very inventive and not naturalistic. People sort of think, this is the miracle of Michelangelo. He makes his figures look like they're believable, incredible. Until you try and get into that pose, or you try to actually look at yourself in the mirror, you realize these figures have nothing to do with nature, and yet Michelangelo really pulls it off, making it look naturalistic. And that's what the Mannerist period was doing, trying to do the same thing, but not very successfully. They're stretching the limbs, elongating the neck or the arms, or increasing the turn of the bodies in very strange ways, all of which Michelangelo did, but so successfully that we think of it as naturalistic and part of the antique language that he inherited, but it's really highly individualized, and that's what people had a very difficult time imitating, and therefore we got mannerisms.
That's an excellent point. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to adopt the pose from the creation of Adam when my mother was trying to pull me out of bed in the morning to get off to school with the limp, languid wrist.
Try any of those 20 ignudi up there. This is something an assignment I give to my students. Each one of them has to be assigned an ignudo. They don't have to get undressed to do this in class, but they have to try out the pose, and they realize in many cases they're completely impossible or truly uncomfortable, really discomforting. And yet Michelangelo makes it look languid and comfortable and natural.
Yeah, that's a great assignment that I encourage everyone to do in his or her home. A conversation about Michelangelo isn't complete without spending a little bit of time on Il Gigante, or David. Quoting Vasari, who was the great biographer of so many artists, who was a contemporary of, not only a contemporary of, but I think a student of Michelangelo in the
As
16th
he claimed.
Oh, well, yeah. Maybe there's not maybe that's not historically creditable.
Well, he was
But
born in 1511. He was very, very young when he met Michelangelo. He was about 9 years old or something like that. But nonetheless, he was a student because he studied Michelangelo.
yeah, maybe from afar. Yeah. So to bolster his reputation, he does claim in his work that in the lives of the artists, similar to Plutarch's lives, that he was a student. Nonetheless, he of course lays out this hagiographic account of Michelangelo in a testament to and an example of Michelangelo's humility, as you explain in your lecture series. Michelangelo blushed at this biography, this encomium, and actually sought out the literary talent of another friend to write a biography that was somewhat more subdued. So just a side note, speaking to the modesty of this great genius, who probably deserved every word of acclaim that Vasari was only too willing to pour upon him, but nonetheless kind of distanced himself from it. My point is that Vasari said about David, quote, "Anyone who sees this statue need not be concerned with seeing any other piece of sculpture done in our times or in any other period by any other artist." The backstory to David, I think, is absolutely fascinating. So for those of us unacquainted with it, maybe you can give us that tale.
The David is a kind of miracle, and I think that's what Vasari is trying to celebrate. He went on and looked at a lot of other statues as well, but he's exaggerating. But let's remember that Vasari is writing a work of literature, and so he's really this is his exaggerated way of praising Michelangelo to the skies. And this particular statue, which was called Il Gigante, which is a really striking thing that in its own time, people were less concerned with calling it a David. They just called it the giant. This was the greatest thing they had ever seen, the largest thing they'd ever seen, the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. And this is what Vasari is trying to celebrate. And it really is a miracle, because this is a block of marble that had been quarried 40 years earlier with the idea that it was going to be carved into a prophet, a clothed prophet. And this block of marble sat around for 40 years before Michelangelo got hold of it. And 3 other artists actually tried to do something with this block, tried to start carving and doing something. And in marble carving, the more you carve, the less you have to work with. And so Michelangelo really inherits a very kind of damaged block of marble that had been sitting outside for 40 years, out in the weather. And marble really is something that is best carved when it's fresh out of the quarries. It's kind of very carvable when it comes fresh out of the quarries, but it becomes very friable and it's very subject to weather. Water penetrates very easily into it, makes it very kind of granular into kind of salt or into sugar. And so this is a block of marble that people had given up on because it was no longer, fresh. And 3 other artists had tried to carve something on it. And Michelangelo, as a very, ambitious 21-year-old, is able to say, I can do something with this marble block. It's not, and he uses every bit of the marble in this very thin block. If you ever look at the David from the side, you'll see exactly how Michelangelo was able to excavate a really brilliant and powerful figure from a very, very thin and almost anemic block. And so it really is something of a miracle of triumph. And it was immediately accepted. It was, of course, a figure that was intended for the cathedral, to decorate the cathedral. But once Michelangelo had carved it, people realized, forget it. It's much too important to leave at the cathedral. Let's bring it to the center of Florence, into Piazza della Signoria, and set it up, and it becomes kind of the symbol of Florence. It becomes a symbol of Florence, a protector of Florence. It also becomes something of a symbol of the whole Renaissance. So in this sense, the David I would say triumphs over becoming just a commission for the cathedral, yet another figure to decorate the great church. and instead becomes a unique symbol of not only Florence, but maybe of the whole Renaissance. And at the moment Michelangelo finished it, he never was out of work again. For 50 years after this or more, everybody wanted something from Michelangelo because he can make miracles.
Right. And that's precisely what Vasari called it. He called the work itself a miracle, and it is miraculous. Although it's not without some disproportions, and critics will point out the fact that the hands seem to be enlarged, the head as well. And of course, there's a incongruity between the shepherd boy whom he's depicting and this gigantic figure. I'm always struck by that, right? The whole point of David's unlikely triumph over Goliath is that he was undersized. It wasn't quite a fair matchup without the use of the sling and God's assistance. So that's something that leads me into my next question, which begins with a quote by the great German aesthetic writer Winckelmann. He said that great artists are wisely negligent, even their errors instruct. Now, I'm not claiming that the disproportions of David or some of Michelangelo's other works are errors, but one could make an argument that perhaps they don't fit the perfect classical ideal. Of course, Michelangelo was sculpting them for certain perspectives, right? If you think about the Pietà, we haven't mentioned that, but the figure of Jesus is quite diminutive in the arms of his, what would have been rather small mother, one would think, a woman at that time in that place of the world. So Michelangelo, like every mortal, was fallible, although his proximity to perfection was certainly closer than most of us will ever know. Tell us, what are some of Michelangelo's errors? How do you discern them in his works, strictly from the perspective of a critic?
Well, I like your word incongruity. It goes back to our discussion about the figures of Michelangelo. If you really examine them, they're not naturalistic, and they're not really necessarily even related to antiquity. Michelangelo is inventing, I would say, the human figure for Michelangelo, the male figure especially, was the most important arena for his creativity. And what he's doing is using the human figure to create unique and unusual inventions, oftentimes incongruous with what they're intended to be. In the case of the David, as you correctly point out, if David is 17 foot tall, Goliath must be 70 feet tall. But of course, he didn't carve a Goliath, and he didn't even carve a David, really. He carved a unique work of art. I would say, in a sense, it was the first work of art in the whole history of art in some ways, because he carved it to be admired as a figure, standing figure, nude standing figure. The fact that he's completely nude is also completely unbiblical. David did not fight Goliath in the nude. And Michelangelo really left us almost, if we didn't know that this was the David, we would have a hard time identifying it as a David. There are none of the usual attributes of David. And David, being one of the most common subjects in Florence, especially, Florence had identified with David for a long, long time. And there were very good examples of previous Davids by Donatello and Verrocchio and others, all of whom were easily identifiable as the young shepherd boy of the Bible. Whereas Michelangelo set out to carve a unique work of art. And he was, I think, realized that this figure, being as heavy as it was never going to be on the cathedral facade. And so he, I think, was liberated in a way to just carve whatever he could out of this block of marble. And what he carved was really a nude standing figure, 17 feet tall, that we call the David, but his contemporaries called it Il Gigante, the great one, the large one, the giant. They weren't worried about its incongruity with the Bible. But let's go back to the other part of your question, which was errors. Yeah, there was a very famous article by James Elkins where he studied the anatomy, the drawings of Michelangelo, and noticed that Michelangelo had better anatomical knowledge than most contemporary medical students. Medical students have to learn, I think, I don't know how many, 140 or so muscles or something like that. Michelangelo apparently knew 400, something like this. And he only made 1 or 2 errors in his drawing, as James Elkins points out. So Michelangelo didn't make errors very often. However, one of the things I've been interested in is that sometimes he ran into problems that were irresolvable. And we see this especially in his marble carving. Irving Stone, to go back to our beginning, Irving Stone describes Michelangelo's ability to look into the block and see the figure and merely liberate it. Well, that's a very poetic and literary way of describing something that's very much more difficult than that, because you can never know if a block of marble is absolutely as pure as it is. The really only pure block of marble Michelangelo ever carved was the Pietà that you mentioned. It is stunning. There's not a single flaw in this block of marble, and it's a very large block. And Michelangelo dreamed of carving such a block of marble for the rest of his life. 40 years after carving the Pietà, he remembered exactly where he had found that block of marble and kept sending his marble quarrying people to get him to quarry marble as equally beautiful as the Pietà. But in fact, he ran into problems quite frequently. And we see this particularly in the 4 slaves that we see in the Academia, where David stands. These are unfinished blocks of marble, unfinished figures that I think he eventually learned to realize that were really very powerful, even unfinished. But there's very clear evidence there that in certain places, he's having trouble with flaws. And he's having to carve away and move his figure in the block of marble in order to avoid bad marble. That's also true of the knight in the Medici Chapel. Her left arm practically doesn't exist, but you don't notice it because of the position that Michelangelo has her in and has placed her high up on that tomb. But she literally ran out of marble, and there's not enough marble there to carve a figure of the arm of the figure. So Michelangelo did run into trouble, and I wouldn't say make errors, but he certainly ran into trouble.
Yeah, that's the sympathetic way of putting it, and very well said.
Sympathetic, yeah.
Conscious of the time remaining, which is about 5 minutes, I have many questions that I'd like to put to you, but there's one on which I'd like to conclude. And to do so, I will again recruit Winckelmann, a quote of his: "Art has a double aim, to delight and to instruct." Which work by Michelangelo, in your opinion, is the most delightful, and which is the most instructive?
Wonderful question. Wonderful question, and difficult to answer because I've never thought of it. I think my approach to Michelangelo, I never look at Michelangelo for delight, I don't think. I am instructed by Michelangelo. The delight is in the instruction. These are not works that just make you happy and think like life is good. These are works, almost everything he does is something that's a bit of a struggle for him and about the world. And they are insights into how to deal with difficult life problems, how to live, how to die. And so I think really Michelangelo's, and maybe the reason we still pay attention to him 500 years later is because he can still instruct us a little bit into what is humankind capable of? What is one human capable of doing? The fact that he did so much in his life and accomplished so much is, as you suggested, kind of an inspiration for us not to think about retiring because we still have other things we could do. And Michelangelo lived his whole life that way. I look at a lot of other things for delight, a lot of other art, most likely like American landscape painting or something like that. Those are the delightful pictures. Michelangelo is constantly telling me something new, which is why I seem not to have gotten away from writing about Michelangelo in over 40 or 50 years. Actually, I've written, it's now 8 books. Some of them are a little popular. They're coffee table books, so which you probably didn't come across. But there are other Michelangelo books out there. The delight is in just looking through the pictures of those books. But no, I think it's mostly instruction that I learned from Michelangelo. Yeah, and I would say almost the same thing about Leonardo. One isn't really delighted to see the Mona Lisa, but you can learn something from the Mona Lisa. Raphael is an artist who sometimes truly just delights because he's so good at what he does and is so colorful, etc. But I can't honestly think of a work by Michelangelo that I would say where delight is the primary motivation or emotion. It is really instruction. And maybe that's why I'm still fascinated by this artist, because I feel like he's still instructing me. And as Michelangelo himself said once, I'm still learning at age 80. So I'm still learning from Michelangelo.
Wow. I don't think there's a better remark on which to end this conversation than that. I'll only spoil the perfection of that sentence by saying that perhaps looking at a work by Michelangelo is akin to reading philosophy or a philosophical novel. Maybe it's akin to reading a difficult work by Dostoevsky, which is in a sense delightful. The Brothers Karamazov is in some way a beautiful book to read, but it's also deeply instructive and unnerving and disquieting, but also elevating. Whereas turning to other artists for delight would be like reading a simpler novel, beautiful, but perhaps not as instructive. I absolutely adore the way that you laid that out. I think it's very well said, and that will certainly stick with me. So, Professor Wallace, we've come up right against our end time. I don't want to blather on any longer than I have already. I just want to thank you very sincerely for joining me for this conversation, and also for putting out so much important work between your books, to which I'll include links in the show notes below, and your excellent lecture series, with which I spent the past couple weeks. I absolutely loved every minute of it. So I encourage everyone to purchase a book, a great gift for the holiday season, a great way to introduce yourself to this man and his amazing collection of works. I don't mean you, I mean Michelangelo. and also maybe purchase yourself a membership to the great courses where you can find Professor Wallace's work. Professor Wallace, I'll leave the last word to you. Is there anything with which you want to leave our listeners and viewers today?
Well, thank you. This has been a delightful conversation. A last word, don't retire. Even if you're 70, even if you're 80, Michelangelo never stopped, and it's an inspiration to me, and hopefully maybe an inspiration to you. And maybe that's the delight of Michelangelo, is that he can really still speak to us after more than 500 years. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk about somebody I take great delight in learning from.
Oh, you're so welcome. And we all take delight in hearing about him from someone like you. So with that, I thank you, all my listeners and viewers, for tuning into this episode of Finneran's Wake. Please subscribe, like, share with friends, all those activities that we encourage you to do. And until next time, I bid you all farewell.